In light of the 2024 fantasy football season coming to an end, here is a complete, very interesting recap of the best and worst draft values from the beginning of the season and how they turned out, along with the top 3 takeaways that we learned we want to be taking into 2025 with us. If you guys do appreciate this video and are feeling generous today, please go down and hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds. It would mean a ton to me and this channel, but I will continue to pump out videos like this throughout the offseason into 2025 like nobody else will. But starting it off with the number 1 biggest letdown, complete just bust of the year. I'm going to be avoiding massive injuries for the most part in this video, but it would be a complete disservice if I didn't put Christian McCaffrey at the number 1 here. He was by far the worst pick of all time, especially in this year. I mean, he was a consensus number 1 pick, number 1 running back by a good amount here. Even if I didn't agree with it, I'm not going to be victory lapping in this video because that just gets annoying. We all know that. But the main reason I say this is because he missed the first 8 games of the year. Now, obviously, that's already going to hurt his value, but then he came back to play 3.5 games just to go down with a PCL injury against the Bills in week 13. Never touched the football field again since then. In those 3 healthy games, though, he was averaging 14.3 carries a game and 13 fantasy points. I fully expect his draft stock to be down into the second round, maybe even later than that in 2025, but no doubt, finishing as the RB67 while being drafted as the consensus number 1 guy is nothing near what we expected. But the best value from this year by a good amount here is going to be Brian Thomas Jr. There were a ton of breakouts this year, and he was one of the guys that started with that. He was being drafted as the wide receiver 48 and managed to finish all the way up at the wide receiver 4. That is one of the best rookie wide receiver seasons of all time, essentially, as far as fantasy football goes, next to Puka Nacua. And a ton of this success came when it mattered most. In the fantasy football playoffs, he was averaging 28.3 fantasy points in that 3-week stretch, and all while being on one of the worst teams in the NFL with the Jaguars, who they're going to have a lottery pick this year. He played with Mac Jones, Trevor Lawrence, a bunch of different quarterbacks here, and a good amount of receiving competition was in this offense with Gabe Davis, Evan Ingram, and Christian Kirk. Now, all of them did get injured and were in and out for the season, but that's besides the point here. The back third of the season is a huge teller of what we can expect for the next season in fantasy football when you get these young rookie and sophomore guys. If you look at his chart since week 12, the bye week that he had, he was averaging 10 targets a game in that stretch, a bunch of yards and a good amount of touchdowns to go on top of that. But unfortunately, that was not the case for all of our Jaguars players here. Travis Etienne, honestly, he might even be worse than Christian McCaffrey because he played the full season fully healthy despite, 2 games? He was drafted as the RB8 and finished as the RB38. That is absolutely terrible. That's behind guys like Justice Hill, Amir Abdullah, even Zach Charbonnet are on this list in front of him in fantasy finishes this year. And a lot of these issues were because the Jaguars were in pass-first situations. Again, it helped Brian Thomas be a top 5 wide receiver finish this year, but even Tank Bigsby finished as a better running back this year in fantasy points. He completely stole the starting role as far as that goes for the Jaguars. And 3 or 4 weeks into the season, Etienne was not an efficient running back by any means, pretty much bottom 5 in every single one of those statistics, isolated. If you draft him, you definitely did not make the playoffs, let alone make a fantasy football championship. But let me know how many wins your fantasy football team ended up getting in the comments this year, and if I miss anybody else in this video. But Brock Bowers, absolute great talent and a great value for what we got in the fantasy drafts. The narrative in the beginning of the year, and one that I also bought into, was that rookie tight ends historically do not produce in fantasy football. Brock Bowers, however, legendary guy in college, legendary guy apparently in the NFL in his first year, breaking all types of rookie receiving records. He broke the rookie record for receiving yards at the tight end position. He also broke Puka Nacua's reception record as a rookie, finishing all as the tight end 1 in fantasy football while being drafted as the tight end 11. Now, that might not seem as crazy when you look at a guy like Brian Thomas or Etienne, who went from the 8 to the 38. It doesn't seem like that big of a jump, but when you look at tight ends, the position is very, very scarce. So the ADP difference is huge. He was an 8th round pick at the 95th spot. He was behind guys like Deontay Johnson, Jake Ferguson, Devin Singletary, but still finished with more fantasy football points than AJ Brown, who was a 1st round pick, Devontae Adams, Mike Evans, Cortland Sutton, who was a really good value. But we cannot leave Deebo Samuel off this list. It would be a disservice if I did that here. He's by far the 3rd worst pick from the fantasy football draft, being drafted as a wide receiver 15, finishing as the wide receiver 41. That's worse than the Eagles defense. That's worse than Alec Pierce. There were 13 kickers in fantasy football that had more points than him at the end of the year. That alone is just absolutely insane. It sheds light on how bad his season was, let alone the fact that we had Brandon Ayuk go out very early in the season with a knee injury more than half the year. That was supposed to be Deebo Samuel's introduction to a true breakout wide receiver 1 season like we saw years ago. The team finished 6th in passing attempts, 9th best in the red zone. He still only averaged 3.4 receptions per game in his healthy contest. That's good for the wide receiver 54. Yes, he dealt with injuries, but again, at his draft capital, did not pan out for what he was. But another running back here that statistically broke out and nobody was expecting, Bucky Irving. This guy was barely drafted in fantasy football leagues. Most leagues, he was on the waiver wire. RB 51 behind Jalen Polk, behind the Texans defense, even behind the tight end 22 and Tyler Conklin, and still managed to overtake all of these guys, overtake Rachaad White for the starting role as the Buccaneers running back 1, finished as the RB 15 on the year. That's great, but he didn't come on until halfway through the season, just about. He was the true RB 1 after their week 12 bye. If you isolate from week 12 to week 17, he's the RB 4 on the year. That's just absolutely insane. He overperformed to the max degree. The entire offense overperformed. Baker Mayfield, top 10 in passing yards and touchdowns. He really helped everybody make the fantasy football playoffs and was in over 10% of starting rosters in the fantasy football championship. But my favorite personal disappointment from this year's draft is Zamir White. Only because this was my pride and joy take earlier in the year. Again, I'm not going to victory lap any of these guys because it does get annoying, but he was being drafted as a top 20 running back, as a sleeper in the mid rounds, about 4th or 5th, and finished as the RB 80. Losing the starting role almost instantly. Now, he was injured a good amount of the season, but when he wasn't, he was in a 3 running back by committee in a terrible offense. People were saying that he was in line to be a great workhorse running back, and he had a ton of receiving upside. Like, he was going to be that guy. It just never happened. He finished behind guys like Blake Corum, who never started a game, behind Mo Alley Cox. Like, I could go forever on the list of players that finished with more fantasy points on the year than him. Even his fantasy points per game in his healthy games were not that good. But one of the most impressive finishes of the year is the combination of Jaden Daniels and Terry McLaurin. First things first, they bring this team from 4 wins last year to over 10, making the playoffs. That's a huge improvement on its own. And Daniels was that breakout quarterback everybody was looking for with the rushing upside we find in and year out. The quarterbacks that can run the ball are the cheat code to fantasy football. He was drafted as the quarterback 12 behind guys like Dak Prescott, CJ Stroud, Brock Purdy, all to finish as the quarterback 4 on the year, only behind guys like Josh Allen, like Lamar Jackson, a bunch of very, very elite quarterbacks. And Terry himself had a great boost in fantasy because of that. In success, he went from the wide receiver 31 behind guys like Raheem Mostert, Christian Kirk being drafted, and finished as the wide receiver 8, making the Pro Bowl and finishing 2nd in total receiving touchdowns on the year, only behind Jamar Chase. I'm proud of my Commanders, but that's besides the point. Looking at one of the biggest draft busts, and one that hits home to a lot of us, is Breece Hall. He didn't fall as low as a bunch of these other guys. He was the RB3 being drafted and finished as the RB16, but that number, when you're being drafted that high as a running back, is very, very insane. It was Christian McCaffrey, it was Bijan, and it was him. Those were the top 3 guys. The sports books even had the Jets projected for over 10 wins on the year and one of the better offenses in the NFL. None of that ended up happening. Breece also started to split time with Braylon Allen, something that nobody expected. That's likely going to continue in the 2025 season as well, so keep an eye out for that, especially if we get Garrett Wilson off the team, leaving in free agency, possibly Aaron Rodgers retiring, or Devontae Adams even going somewhere else. This team could really be in some trouble, and again, he finished as the RB16 behind guys like Bucky Irving, who came on halfway through the year, and David Montgomery, who's technically a running back too. If you drafted him, there was a very small chance that you made it to the fantasy football championship. I know I drafted him in a few leagues, but he also finished behind guys like Chase Brown, who was a massive breakout again halfway through the year, being drafted as the RB36 and finishing as the RB10 on the year, despite not getting the true RB1 role until week 9, which was his first game above an 80% snap share for the entire season. If you isolate those games from week 9 on, he was the RB6 in fantasy football points per game and total points. Unless the Bengals draft another running back in this year's actual NFL draft, there really shouldn't be a reason for him not to continue another great fantasy football season with the receiving upside that he does have, and how bad this defense is. They need to get the ball out and just pass a ton, which is why he was so successful. But a group of wide receivers that did not pan out, I'm going to put them all together because there are a lot and they all were terrible. It's going to be Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, and Marvin Harrison Jr., all wide receivers taken in the first 2 rounds of fantasy football. When you look at the stats here, Tyreek was by far the worst. He was taken as the wide receiver 2, only behind CeeDee Lamb. In a lot of leagues, he was going as the number 1 and finished as the wide receiver 18. The entire offense struggled all year long. You can also include Jalen Waddle in this list. He was the wide receiver 20 being drafted and finished as a wide receiver 48. Cooper Kupp was also one of the biggest risers in the offseason and the pre-draft process. He was essentially a 2nd round pick when we got to that end pinnacle of the fantasy football draft season, taken as the wide receiver 12, 13, 14 in most leagues, just to finish as the wide receiver 36. Now, yes, he did deal with injury, missing 4 weeks of the season, but he could not stay consistent even in those healthy games. In the back third of the year, that was really where he struggled. From week 13 and on, he was the wide receiver 67 behind guys like Dontavian Wicks, Mac Hollins, even Trey Tucker, and he was fully healthy in those weeks. So it's just, who knows what to expect for the 2025 season. He's definitely single-handedly kicked you out of the fantasy football playoffs if you even made it to there. But if you had Marvin Harrison, you probably didn't even get to make it to the playoffs in the first place. He was being drafted in the first or second round in most leagues as the wide receiver 9, coming into what was supposed to be a great situation here with Kyler Murray at quarterback, by far a capable guy, not much target competition, but finished as the wide receiver 34 with more 5-point fantasy football games than 20-plus point fantasy football games. It just was not a great season. It was up and down, but mostly down for him. But luckily, we did have Ladd McConkey on the other side of these rookie wide receivers that did have a great season and pan out for us. He was in a lot of fantasy football championship rosters. He was a great value for what he was coming into the year as the wide receiver 43 next to guys like Christian Watson, Jonathan Brooks at the running back position, but managed to finish as the wide receiver 12, which was a huge improvement. He had the highest target share on the team, the most targets, you led in all the receiving statistics. But Kyle Pitts on the other side was one of the guys that was an absolute bust in the draft process and turned out to be very bad for the 3rd year in a row. This happens every single year. Something's going to change. They have a new coach. Kirk Cousins is on the team. No, it never happened. Ever since his rookie year, his breakout rookie year, where he was the tight end 6, he's been the tight end 33, the tight end 13, and then this year, the tight end 14, despite being drafted as the tight end 7 again. At this point, he might never get himself off the do not draft list, and I promise, with the upside that Michael Penix has been showing for the last few weeks of the year, he's gonna be in this list again of sleeper guys that everybody's talking about next year. He will be classified as that, probably going in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th round of fantasy football drafts. He's probably gonna disappoint again. Just wait for that to come around. But a highlight to make on some amazing wide receivers here that we got off the waiver wire and destroyed at their value was Rico Dowdle, Jonnu Smith, and Sam Darnold. Out of all people, Rico was the RB45 coming into the year, a clear number 2, even number 3 for the Cowboys offense, behind Ezekiel Elliott, behind Deuce Vaughn. Came up in this backfield and earned that number 1 job pretty quickly. Ever since returning from injury in the bye week in week 7, he did not miss a game since then, finished as the RB16 in that stretch, and was the RB23 to finish on the entirety of the season, even before he was a starter. And then you look at Jonnu Smith, who kind of broke out behind Kyle Pitts 2 seasons ago with the Falcons. He finished as the tight end 17, but in the top half of the year, he was the tight end 7 once he got a 50% snap share, and then he gets brought onto the Dolphins, replacing Mike Gesicki, and he finishes as the tight end 4 on the year, despite going undrafted as the tight end 24 in the beginning of this fantasy football season. The Dolphins offense has completely changed to one that really utilizes the short check down game, which is why Devon Achane had a breakout season, and also the short routes in Jonnu Smith also got some benefits from that, and we saw Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle take a step back. But Sam Darnold was possibly the biggest quarterback surprise this year, being drafted as the QB 30. Like, that is absolutely insane. Only in front of Drake May and Daniel Jones. Drake May didn't even start half the year. Daniel Jones got cut. Like, he's not even on the Giants anymore, but he managed to finish as the quarterback 8, better than Patrick Mahomes, better than CJ Stroud, finishing with the 4th most passing yards and the 5th most touchdowns with 35. But speaking of CJ Stroud and Anthony Richardson, these were 2 guys that were by far the biggest quarterback letdowns, being drafted insanely high. CJ Stroud came off an amazing rookie season, finishing as the quarterback 10, just to follow up with a sophomore slump, being the quarterback 18 and being drafted as the quarterback 5 last year. But possibly even worse than that, Anthony Richardson, he was the quarterback 6 coming into the year, finishing as the quarterback 23 at the end. A ton of missed games in that stretch, yes, but he did play very atrocious when he was healthy. He had multiple fully healthy games where he finished with less than 10 completions. Like, that's just not something you see in the National Football League. But if your players did not make this list, here's a quick list of the guys that are honorable mentions of guys that did not pan out. Sam Laporta can be on here, the tight end 2 being drafted and then turned into the tight end 8. Amari Cooper, wide receiver 25, turned into be the wide receiver 58. You could also add Nick Chubb in here. RB34 went to RB59, even though he did play halfway through the season. Jalen Waddle, again, the RB20 to the RB48. DK, we can also add on this list, drafted as the wide receiver 19, finishing as the wide receiver 35. Michael Pittman Jr. Surprisingly, nobody remembers this. He was being drafted as the wide receiver 17. Again, they probably went with the Anthony Richardson hype, and he finished as the wide receiver 42. Worse than Josh Downs. Alec Pierce had more breakout games than he did this year. But I'll leave you with the top 3 lessons that we learned from fantasy football in 2024 to remember for next season moving forward. Number 1, by far, this tip is going to be prioritize the waiver wire running back specifically. Waiver wire in general is there for a reason. Use it. Put a bunch of emphasis in that part of the year for you. But there's always at least 3 specific running backs that break out every year and win us leagues. This year, it was Tyrone Tracy, Bucky Irving, Zach Charbonnet, even Kareem Hunt. The second tip and takeaway is to prioritize quarterbacks that do have rushing upside. Now, like we saw with Anthony Richardson, you have to be calculated with this. Sometimes it does not turn out, but the top quarterbacks are almost always guys with a ton of rushing upside or insane pass volume. We look at the top 5 from the season that just finished. Lamar Jackson, insane rushing upside. Josh Allen, the number 2, great rushing upside. Joe Burrow, insane passing volume. Jaden Daniels, great rushing upside. Baker Mayfield, insane passing volume, and was very, very efficient this year. And the last lesson I'm going to leave you guys with for this year is to take risks on rookie and sophomore players in the middle or late rounds of your fantasy football drafts. Guys without proven track records, like Marvin Harrison, for example, are wildly overvalued or extremely slept on and undervalued and overshadowed by the big names. Last year, we had guys like Jaden Daniels, Brock Bowers, Brian Thomas, all taken past the 5th round in fantasy football drafts, finished as very, very good fantasy players. But that is going to finish off this video. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the 2024 fantasy football recap. I will see you throughout the offseason and all of those videos coming very, very soon. Thank you guys for watching this one. All glory to the man above.